In 1967, a cat stepped out of a surveillance van on a street near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. According to declassified CIA documents, the animal carried inside its body a surgically implanted radio transmitter, a microphone embedded in its ear canal, and a wire antenna woven into its tail. The cat had been trained for approximately 5 years and had cost the Central Intelligence Agency an estimated $20 million in research, development, and operational preparation. Its mission was to approach two Soviet officials sitting on a park bench and position itself close enough for the microphone to capture their conversation. The cat made it approximately 15 feet before it was struck by a taxi and killed instantly. Technical officers immediately retrieved the animal's body and returned to their vehicle. The entire operation, from the moment the cat was released to the moment its body was recovered, lasted approximately 4 minutes. Within hours, a preliminary assessment had been drafted. Within 6 months, the project, internally designated Acoustic Kitty, would be formally terminated, its files classified, and its existence scrubbed from all but the most restricted internal records. The cat's death marked the end of one of the most unusual technical collection programs in CIA history, a program that would remain classified for more than 3 decades. Before we continue this story of Cold War excess and the $20 million cat that never made it across the street, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War intelligence operations and the real cost behind these classified programs, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these declassified cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most bizarre intelligence failures. Now, let's talk about how the CIA came to spend 5 years and $20 million training a cat to spy on Soviet officials. The question of how the Central Intelligence Agency came to pursue such a program cannot be answered without understanding the context of Cold War intelligence collection and the institutional culture that had developed within the agency's Directorate of Science and Technology by the mid-1960s. In the years following World War II, American intelligence agencies faced a fundamental problem. The Soviet Union was a closed society that permitted virtually no access to its internal decision-making processes, military capabilities, or strategic intentions. Traditional human intelligence, the recruitment of assets who could provide information from inside the Soviet government, was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. As a result, American intelligence agencies invested heavily in technical collection methods that could gather information without requiring human penetration of Soviet organizations. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, established in 1963, was responsible for developing these technical systems. The Directorate employed scientists and engineers who were encouraged to think creatively about unconventional approaches to intelligence problems. The institutional culture valued innovation and technical sophistication. Projects that might have seemed impractical in other contexts were given serious consideration and substantial funding. According to a declassified CIA memorandum dated March 1967 entitled Views on Trained Cats, a retrospective assessment, Project Acoustic. Kitty originated during a brainstorming session in the early 1960s focused on what the memo described as the problem of emplacing audio surveillance devices in locations where traditional methods are impractical or likely to be detected. The specific challenge was this: Soviet officials operating in the United States knew they were under FBI surveillance. They avoided discussing sensitive matters over telephone lines or inside embassy buildings, both of which they correctly assumed were monitored. When they needed to have conversations that could not be overheard, they would go outside, to parks, streets, and public spaces where traditional surveillance devices could not easily be positioned without risk of detection. Someone suggested using an animal. The reasoning was straightforward. Animals are common in urban environments, particularly parks. A cat or dog wandering near a park bench would not arouse suspicion if the animal could be equipped with a miniaturized radio transmitter and microphone, and if it could be trained to position itself near targets, it could function as a mobile listening device that would draw no attention. The idea was not immediately pursued, but over the following months it was periodically revisited. By mid-1962, Preliminary research had been authorized to determine whether the concept had technical merit. Initial research was conducted by the CIA's Office of Technical Service in collaboration with veterinary specialists. The research had two primary objectives. First, to determine whether miniaturized audio transmission equipment could be surgically implanted into an animal without causing death or impairment. And second, to determine whether an animal could be trained to perform the specific behaviors required for an intelligence operation. Dogs were considered but rejected because they were too conspicuous and too likely to draw human interaction. Smaller animals were rejected because they could not carry the necessary equipment. Cats were selected as the optimal compromise. They were common in urban environments, large enough to carry miniaturized transmission equipment, and sufficiently independent that their presence would not immediately suggest human involvement. By early 1963, the project had been formally designated Acoustic Kitty and assigned a dedicated budget and staff. The technical challenges were formidable. Radio transmitters small enough to fit inside a cat's body did not exist in the early 1960s. The team was required to develop custom electronics that could transmit a clear audio signal over several hundred yards while operating on a battery small enough to be implanted surgically. According to declassified technical specifications, the final design incorporated a microphone approximately 3 millimeters in diameter, implanted in the cat's ear canal. A radio transmitter measuring approximately 2 centimeters in length and weighing less than 10 grams was implanted in the chest cavity. A thin wire antenna approximately 8 inches long was surgically woven along the length of the cat's tail. The entire system was powered by a battery implanted in the abdominal cavity. The surgical implantation procedure was developed over more than a year through experimental trials. Early procedures resulted in complications from infection, tissue rejection, and anesthesia. Veterinary staff refined the techniques, experimented with different materials to reduce tissue rejection, and developed post-operative protocols that improved survival rates. By mid-1964, technical teams had successfully implanted the full audio transmission system into several cats that survived the procedure and recovered without significant complications. Audio tests confirmed that the system functioned as designed, producing clear recordings of conversations within a range of approximately 6 to 8 feet, depending on environmental conditions. The training program, however, proved significantly more challenging than the surgical procedures. Training was overseen by a veterinary behaviorist who approached the program with methodical rigor. The initial phase involved basic conditioning, teaching the cats to associate specific sounds with food rewards. This phase lasted approximately 2 months and was relatively straightforward. The next phase involved teaching the cats to approach specific locations on command. Trainers would place the cats in enclosed spaces, emit designated sounds, and reward them when they moved toward particular spots. Over time, visual indicators were made less conspicuous, and the cats were expected to approach designated locations based on audio cues alone. This phase lasted approximately 6 months and produced mixed results. Some cats demonstrated the ability to approach designated locations with reasonable consistency in controlled environments. The most challenging phase involved teaching the cats to approach and remain near human targets in uncontrolled outdoor environments. This required the cats to generalize behaviors they had learned in controlled settings to outdoor spaces with distractions and unpredictable variables. The results were inconsistent. According to internal progress reports from the mid-1960s, the cats would sometimes approach designated targets as trained, but would just as often become distracted by other stimuli, birds, other animals, passing pedestrians, and would wander away. Attempts to increase focus through more intensive training produced only marginal improvements. The program's behavioral specialists later wrote in an internal assessment that the fundamental problem was one of motivation. Dogs are pack animals with an evolved inclination to respond to commands from a perceived leader. Cats are solitary hunters with no comparable evolutionary drive to defer to authority. Training a cat to perform a specific behavior in a controlled environment is possible because the cat learns to associate that behavior with a reward. But in an uncontrolled environment where the cat has access to multiple potential sources of interest, there is no reliable way to ensure it will prioritize the trained behavior over its own inclinations. Despite these concerns, program managers determined that while the cat's performance was inconsistent, it was sufficient to justify a limited operational trial. A decision was made to conduct a field test using one of the trained cats in an actual intelligence collection scenario. The target was a meeting between two Soviet embassy officials who, according to FBI surveillance reports, frequently met in a park to have conversations that investigators believed involved sensitive matters. The CIA had attempted to intercept these conversations using directional microphones positioned in nearby vehicles, but the results had been unsatisfactory due to distance and background noise. The operation was planned for a weekday morning. The two Soviet officials were known to meet at a specific park bench. The plan was to position a surveillance van on the street adjacent to the park, release the cat when the officials arrived, use audio cues to direct the cat toward the bench, and record their conversation. On the morning of the operation, the surveillance van was in position. The two Soviet officials arrived and sat down on the designated bench. Technical officers opened the van's door, released the cat, and emitted the audio cue. The cat exited the van and began walking in the general direction of the park bench. According to the after-action report, the cat's initial trajectory was consistent with the trained behavior. However, instead of continuing directly toward the bench, the cat altered its course slightly, moving toward the street. A taxi appeared, traveling at moderate speed. The cat stepped directly into the vehicle's path. The collision occurred within minutes of the cat being released from the van. Technical officers immediately exited the van and approached the scene. The cat was dead. The audio transmission had ceased. The two Soviet officials, who were approximately 50 yards away, appeared not to have noticed the incident. The officers retrieved the cat's body, returned to the van, and departed. The total duration of the operation from release to recovery was approximately 4 minutes. The decision to terminate Acoustic Kitty was not immediate. In the days following the failed field test, program managers and technical staff met to assess what had gone wrong and whether modifications might address the identified problems. Several theories were proposed. Some argued that the cat had become disoriented by the unfamiliar environment. Others suggested it had been distracted by something it had seen or smelled. Still others proposed that the cat had simply behaved unpredictably, as cats do, and that no amount of training could eliminate this variability. The program's behavioral specialist argued in a written assessment that the failure was predictable and that the project's fundamental premise was flawed. The training program had consistently demonstrated that cats could not be reliably controlled in unstructured environments, and attempting to use them for intelligence operations requiring precise behaviors was impractical. The specialist recommended that the project be terminated and that future technical collection efforts focus on systems that did not depend on animal behavior. Others were less willing to abandon the project. They argued that the field test represented a single incident, that the cat's death had been a matter of chance rather than systemic failure, and that future operations using different protocols might succeed. However, the program's sponsors within the Directorate of Science and Technology were no longer convinced that Acoustic Kitty represented a viable approach. The project had consumed 5 years and more than 20 million without producing usable intelligence. The single operational field test had failed within minutes. Alternative technical collection methods were showing more promise. In December 1967, 6 months after the failed field test, Project Acoustic Kitty was formally terminated. The project's files were classified at the highest levels. The equipment, research notes, and training protocols were placed in secure storage. The existence of Acoustic Kitty remained classified for more than 3 decades. The project was not mentioned in publicly available CIA documents or histories. It was not until 2001, following a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Jeffrey Richelson, a researcher at the National Security Archive, that the CIA declassified documents related to the project, including the March 1967 Views on Trained Cats Memorandum and several technical specifications. The declassified materials provided limited details about the project's scope, duration, and cost. The CIA's official statement described Acoustic Kitty as a research program conducted in the 1960s to explore novel approaches to technical collection and acknowledged that the program did not produce operational results. The statement did not address the cost estimate, the duration, or the specific circumstances of the field test failure. Public reaction to the revelation was a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and criticism. Media coverage focused on what appeared to be the absurdity of the project. The image of CIA scientists surgically implanting microphones into cats became a popular example of Cold War excess and institutional hubris. From the perspective of those familiar with research and development processes, however, the public reaction reflected a misunderstanding of how such programs function. The underlying technical problem Acoustic Kitty sought to address, how to conduct audio surveillance in outdoor environments without detection, was a legitimate intelligence challenge. The approach of using animals as platforms for surveillance equipment was unconventional, but not irrational, given the constraints of 1960s technology. The project had been pursued methodically, with research, development, and testing. Its failure represented the inherent uncertainty of trying to solve difficult technical problems using novel approaches. Many of the technical developments from Acoustic Kitty, the miniaturized transmitters, the implantable microphones, the power systems, were subsequently adapted for other applications, both within the intelligence community and in civilian sectors such as medical devices and wildlife research. The question of whether Acoustic Kitty represented a worthwhile investment cannot be answered definitively. From a strictly operational perspective, the project was a failure. It consumed 5 years and substantial resources without producing usable intelligence. From a research and development perspective, the assessment is more complex. The project advanced miniaturized audio transmission technology and explored the feasibility of using animals for intelligence collection, ultimately determining that such an approach was impractical with available training methods. What is less ambiguous is the treatment of the animals involved. The declassified documents do not provide detailed information about how many cats were used in the program over its 5-year duration. The March 1967 memo references multiple cats that had successfully undergone surgical implantation, but it is unclear how many other animals were used in earlier experiments, how many died during or after procedures, and what happened to those deemed unsuitable for operational use. The cats involved in Acoustic Kitty were subjected to invasive surgical procedures, had foreign objects implanted in their bodies, were subjected to intensive training regimens, and in at least one documented case were deployed on a mission that resulted in death. There is no indication in the declassified documents that anyone involved in the project questioned whether this use of animals was appropriate or justified. This reflects the broader ethical environment of Cold War intelligence research in the 1960s. During this period, the CIA and other intelligence agencies conducted numerous programs that would be considered unethical or illegal by contemporary standards, including medical experiments on unwitting subjects and research involving dangerous materials. The institutional culture prioritized operational effectiveness and technical advancement, and there were few external oversight mechanisms to constrain what agencies could do in the name of national security. The cat that died during the 1967 field test had no awareness of the Cold War, no understanding of intelligence operations, no choice in whether to participate in the mission that killed it. It was selected, surgically altered, trained, and deployed by people pursuing objectives that had nothing to do with the animal's welfare. Its death was the result of decisions made by individuals operating within institutional and historical contexts that encouraged them to pursue technical solutions to intelligence problems without considering whether those solutions were appropriate or humane. By the time Acoustic Kitty's existence was declassified in 2001, the Cold War had ended more than a decade earlier. The Soviet Union had dissolved in 1991. The ideological and military competition that had driven intelligence agencies to pursue projects like Acoustic Kitty no longer existed in the same form. The specific intelligence problems the project had been designed to address had become historical curiosities rather than operational priorities. The technologies that made Acoustic Kitty seem necessary in the 1960s have long since been superseded. Miniaturized recording devices, satellite systems, and other technical collection methods can now solve the audio surveillance challenges that Acoustic Kitty was designed to address, without requiring the use of animals. What remains is the historical record of a program that exemplifies both the innovative ambition and the ethical blind spots of Cold War intelligence operations. Acoustic Kitty was the product of intelligent, competent professionals working within an institutional culture that valued technical creativity and unconventional problem solving. It was also the product of a system that treated living beings as tools to be engineered and deployed, that prioritized operational objectives over welfare considerations, and that operated with minimal oversight or accountability. The project persisted for 5 years, not because anyone believed with certainty that it would work, but because institutional momentum, incremental investment, and compartmentalized decision-making created conditions where no single point existed to comprehensively assess viability and make a definitive decision to terminate. The behavioral specialists knew the training was not producing reliable results, but they were responsible for training, not for operational decisions. The program managers knew the project was expensive and had not yet produced results, but they were judged on their ability to manage programs. The senior leadership knew they were funding an unconventional project, but they were insulated from day-to-day evidence of its impracticality. It was only when the project failed in a way that could not be ignored, when the cat was killed minutes into its first mission, that the institutional momentum was finally overcome and the decision to terminate was made. The real lesson of Acoustic Kitty is not about cats or Cold War paranoia or wasteful government spending. The real lesson is about how institutions make decisions, how expertise is organized and compartmentalized, how resources are allocated, how projects gain momentum, and how failures are eventually recognized and acknowledged. These dynamics are not unique to the CIA or to the 1960s. They reflect patterns in how governments, corporations, and other large organizations pursue objectives and make decisions, patterns that remain relevant today. The cat that was killed in 1967 never had a name recorded in any document that has been declassified. It lived approximately 2 years. It underwent surgical procedures that implanted electronic equipment into its body. It was trained for months to perform behaviors it did not understand for purposes it could not comprehend. It was sent on a mission that killed it within minutes, and then it was retrieved, documented in an after-action report, and ultimately became a historical footnote about Cold War excess and institutional failure. The cat could not have known any of this. It could not have understood the systems, the ideologies, the organizational priorities, or the historical context that determined its fate. It was simply an animal that had the misfortune to be selected for a project that treated it as a tool rather than as a being with interests that mattered independently of human objectives. Project Acoustic Kitty cost an estimated $20 million. It lasted approximately 5 years. It conducted one documented operational field test that failed within minutes. It produced no usable intelligence. It reflected the institutional culture, ethical frameworks, and operational priorities of the 1960s American intelligence community, and it killed at least one cat whose death was noted in classified reports as an operational setback, but whose life was never considered worth documenting beyond its instrumental value to a program that failed.